to facilitate 47 archipelagic and island nations to collaborate and cooperate in addressing common challenges in 4 thematic areas: climate change mitigation and adaptation, blue economy, marine plastic debris, and good maritime governance. In 2017, the idea to establish the multinational cooperation framework among the archipelagic and island states was first iterated during the UN Ocean Conference in New York. In November 2018, Indonesia hosted the first ministerial meeting with 21 archipelagic and island states. The Archipelagic and Island States Forum was established by Manando Joint Declaration. In the following year, the second ministerial meeting adopted the final outcome with 25 AIS participating countries. To achieve our vision, we focus on 4 objectives which we translate into our programs. Create an open, innovative, and engaging forum. Provide a space to share and implement innovative and tangible programs. Promote collaborative efforts among stakeholders. And create opportunity through the blue economy. Ideation, implementation, and evaluation are the core elements to our solution framework in addressing the problems. In 2020, AIS Forum launched programs to drive innovation, which are AIS Joint Research, a collaborative applied research program affiliated with academic institutions in AIS countries with various topics related to the 4 areas of collaboration. The Innovator Scholarship Program, a fully funded exchange program for talented individuals from AIS participating countries who can demonstrate exceptional leadership quality and creative mind, and AIS Innovation Challenge, to find innovative ideas and breakthroughs that can help societies and businesses to be more resilient and adaptive during crisis situations. AIS Forum also launched AIS Blue Startup Hub, a platform to connect marine-focused startup in 47 archipelagic and island states across the globe. AIS Blue Startup Hub Mentoring Program was launched with 18 participating startups from 6 countries. As an effort to realize the smart, innovative solutions, AIS Forum also engaged with public audiences through online events in a form of trainings, workshops, talk shows, and discussions with various topics and stakeholders across AIS participating countries. In light of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important for archipelagic and island states to have a resilient economy. Therefore, AIS Forum Secretariat introduces programs which focuses on blue economy. As a form of its commitment, AIS Forum developed Blue Economy Development Index, or BEDI. This index will be used as a tracking tool to determine the current use of coastal and marine resources, and it can be used as a tool to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Blue Financing Framework, or BFF, which provides a guidance for governments, financial institutions, philanthropists, and donors to align their investments with the blue economy principles and allow them to select a project to be financed in the blue economy sectors. Smart and innovative solution programs, such as sharing knowledge sessions with experts and representatives from AIS participating countries. Plankton, which was a competition to raise awareness in reducing marine plastic debris. Impact pitching, which connects startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, potential investors, and growth enablers to gain partnership. And Ending Plastic Pollution Innovation Challenge, which was a collaboration with Marine Plastic Debris Project from UNDP Indonesia to address marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Many solutions to challenges that affect AIS participating countries in 4 main thematic areas and SDG 14 goals are produced through collaboration programs. These programs will explore opportunities through innovation and experiment that benefits on a local, regional, and international scale through sharing knowledge and experiences between AIS participating countries.
So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Archipelagic and Island States Forum Scholar Space. This is a platform for knowledge sharing between the public, academias out there, and all stakeholders from the universities and research institutions throughout the Archipelagic Island States Forum. Today, we'll be discussing about innovative responses to climate change in islands and small states. This initiative is brought to you by the AIS Forum in collaboration with the Islands and Small Institutes University of Malta. My name is Ahmad Sani. I'm the project coordinator of Archipelagic and Island States Forum here at UNDP Indonesia. And before we start the discussion, allow me to briefly explain about the AIS Forum. I'm just going to share my screen. I promise you this will be very quick. Can you see my screen? Hopefully you can. Yes, thank you. So essentially, the Archipelagic and Island States Forum is a platform to accommodate all Archipelagic and Island States Forum regardless of their level of development and size. We have 4 areas of collaboration. We call it the thematic areas. The first one is climate change mitigation and adaptation, which is roughly what we'll be discussing today. And secondly, we have the blue economy. The third one is marine plastic debris and good maritime governance. So in terms of our initiatives around universities and academic institutions, we have several programs, and today is the Scholar Space. But on top of that, we also have our Joint Research Grants Program, our Innovator Scholarship, and internship as well. And you can find those information on our website, www.aisforum.org. And this is just a map of our participating states throughout the world. So I think before we proceeding to our main discussion, please fill out the attendance list, a link in the chat box in order for you to get the certificate. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to the moderator for the discussion, Professor Godfrey Baldacchino. I hope I get that correct. He's the chairperson of the board of the Islands and Small States Institute of the University of Malta and the ambassador of the Republic of Malta for Islands and Small States. Hello, how are you, sir?
Not too bad, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon.
Great. Can't wait to hear the discussion that is led by you. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, Professor Godfrey, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmad. I hope you don't mind first names. It's easier. It also saves you the trouble of trying to pronounce my family name. You can call me Godfrey. It's a pleasure to be here today, welcoming friends and new friends to this interesting conversation on the theme of innovative responses to climate change in islands and small states. We all know about the dramatic effects of climate change, especially on low-lying islands. It's possibly one of the most visible manifestations of international diplomacy that has happened in recent decades. It is now the main way in which small island jurisdictions actually have a presence on the world stage, by arguing with the world community that even though they are the least guilty of the causes of climate change, at the same time, they are the most likely victims of its consequences. But this up to a certain point is old hat now. You know, this kind of discourse has been going on and on and on. And in the meantime, who is to take responsibility for doing something about it? Is it just the pollutants, the large countries, the industrialized countries, who perhaps owe us, residents, islanders of small states, a better life, a better future? Or is it also us, the citizens, the residents of these island jurisdictions, who are tasked to, pick up our pants and run along with anything that we think we should do in order to prevent the inevitable? So I think this is the context in which we have an excellent panel today, discussing once again responses to climate change, but with an emphasis on innovation. What can we do new what else is being done that is fairly new in this now long-drawn saga of action and of policy promotion. And now I would like to present the members of the panel to you. They all come from islands, some smaller, some larger than others. I start with Dr. Stefano Moncada, who is a lecturer at the University of Malta. He lectures in the Institute of European Studies. At the same time, he's also here as the director of the Islands and Small States Institute. He also heads the Climate Change Forum and platform at the University of Malta. I also like to welcome from the slightly larger island of Britain, Aiden Foley. She comes to us from the Department of Geography of Birkbeck College, University of London, where she's a senior lecturer. And then moving on to a slightly larger island, Australia, we have Professor Patrick Nunn, who is also a geographer, but I also associate him with environmental studies. I hope he doesn't mind that. He's fairly interdisciplinarian. And he comes from the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. We have these three panelists. They all have their own particular expertise, if I may say so. Stefano comes to us mainly from a development studies perspective, Aideen more from a geography, but also I would see her very much as a climatologist. She's very much on the ball in terms of climate science. And Patrick is a wonderfully eclectic scholar. He bridges archaeology, environmental studies, and geography in a very interesting manner. They also have expertise in different parts of the world. So while we recognize that climate issues affect all islands, climate issues affect some islands more than others. And I'm sure that particularly in relation to areas in the Indo-Pacific region, where the Archipelagic and Island States Forum has a special interest, I hope we'll be able to dedicate some time to discuss issues that are particular to that region, but of course can apply in a more generic way to other islands and small states around the world. As for the rules of engagement, the panelists are being asked to make a presentation of approximately 15 minutes each. They will be accompanying their presentation with slides. In the meantime, the chat on Zoom is activated, so I encourage all the panelists and the participants, but of course, mainly the participants, to voice their comments or field their questions on the chat function. I'll be monitoring that. I'm sure Livita will be doing that as well, just in case I miss something. And after the panelists have had their say, we will invite Q&As and comments from the floor. Right, so it's 9:10, we're doing very well on time. I'd like to start by inviting Stefano to give us perhaps the context of what we are discussing today. Stefano, the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you, Godfrey. Thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'd like first to start, before sharing my screen, by sending our deepest thoughts and vicinity to all friends and colleagues in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, suffering from the eruption of Soufriere volcano. Also the people of Indonesia and Timor-Leste, the consequences of Cyclone Soroya and other parts of the world in that region that have been affected. I'd like to thank the IS Forum to have agreed to co-organize this webinar with us, with the University of Malta, and our colleagues who have accepted today to be on the panel. Like Godfrey was reminding, I'm the director of the Islands and Small State Institute of the University of Malta. Our institute promotes teaching, research, and training on many aspects of islands and small states. Very proudly also we offer what appears to be the only doctorate program that focuses specifically on islands and small state studies. So I'm very proud of that. Now, let's start to share some of the thoughts we wanted to discuss with you today. I guess you can see the screen, correct? Very good.
Yes.
Now, I will take you through these 4 key points. First, highlight why islands and small states are so special. So what is the thing that makes them, probably unique also in the scholarship. Then talk to you about different ways on how development has been happening in islands, and why we consider sometimes this to be mostly parachuted, and it is not necessarily a good thing. And then talk about some traditional but probably innovative ways on how to conceive development, and the innovations that it's been brewing in that area, and perhaps give some examples as well. Now, why are islands so special? Well, islands tend to be unique. We know that. They have developed biogeographical features that make them unique, and even cultural and societal characteristics that generally are also regarded to be unique. This is especially for the role of social capital, many argue, which is particularly strong and important. Islands are also very different with one another, right? We can find low-lying islands, volcanic and mountainous islands. Islands also are, at different degrees from the equator. So you can find, of course, islands that are up in the Arctic and islands that are just on the tropics. Some are high income, some are low income, many are middle income. So there's a lot of diversity. Now, notwithstanding this diversity, islands also share a lot of similar characteristics. They share similar and face similar vulnerabilities, especially to natural hazards. And this is due mostly to the small size and remoteness, which limit the economics of scale and increase the cost of practically everything, from transportation to production, even running a state and administration. It costs relatively more. Why? Because the cost per capita are much higher for a small state, for an island. Now, notwithstanding these vulnerabilities, many islands have managed to build strong and resilient economies and societies. Now, this is due to a mix of resourcefulness of islanders, but also due to an appropriate set of policy measures that have been adopted by authorities, by islanders, to support resilience building, right? To make the development happening in the first place. Now, however, these efforts to build resilience, to face these vulnerabilities, comes at a high cost. As I was saying, the per capita cost in islands are much higher than any other larger state. So building this resilience, trying to put together all these efforts to manage these vulnerabilities, these challenges, is costly. So this puts islands in general at a disadvantage. Now, this aspect is not sufficiently accounted for by the international community, we believe, when deciding, for example, to lend funds for development, when providing aid, treating islands like other countries where perhaps this initial challenge and the higher cost of doing and responding to these challenges on the ground is not really accounted for, okay? So there is another interesting point that research-wise that makes islands so special. We are probably only at the beginning of the study of islands as small states, although also very important colleagues who are also present today in this seminar have been studying for many years these issues and how islands and small states are so special and how sometimes theories might differ. We are just at the beginning, right? And the majority of the well-established theories have rarely included islands in their, in their knowledge when creating these theories, when testing these theories. So many of these theories are being also revisited. Why? Because the findings that keep on coming up from islands tell us that perhaps those theories were not so well equipped to understand how those phenomena were tackled in the islands. Therefore, slowly, this evidence by scholars studying islands are also kind of shaking, the world of established theories. I think this is enough of a good argument to support why islands are so special. So I'll move on to the next argument. Now, in terms of climate change, we know that it's widely accepted. Climate, affecting especially small island developing states quite severely due to the high concentration of activities by the coast and generally limited resource endowment. Also, lack of data and research in many of these islands remains a problem. This is especially true for some of the world's most vulnerable communities, especially those who live in rural areas or more remote, which are paradoxically excluded from most of this research. Also, there are some studies often done at the macro level, which are not meaningful at the local level. Aiden probably will go through this a bit better later on, and therefore they cannot address the real issues that happen at the level where they're important in islands. Now, how does international aid and development comes into the equation? Now, let me very briefly go through this idea that there are different schools of thoughts on whether international aid has helped economic development, okay, for islands in general, for countries. There is the yes argument, there is the no argument, and there is yes, but depends, right? On, for example, on your level of democracy, on your level of institutions working on the ground, right? Now, without going into this debate, which is not the space probably, if we exclude some few examples, the majority of international aid has, in fact, had a positive effect on the development of countries, especially for those areas like education and health, where this kind of kicked off the starting off of the process of development. However, all aid comes with a baggage, right? Usually, it's like political strings or maybe high debt, and it has often used, many say, to control countries, or an extension of what once was the formal colonial power. Okay, so there is a lot of controversy over also the nature of aid. Another problem we have with aid is that it is rarely listens to local needs. Now, and if it does, it tends to parachute solutions that might not be so important or applicable at the local level. So, and do not resonate with traditional or local knowledge. So this is an important point, because why is that? Because the aid loses its effectiveness, okay? So aid does not help as it could or it should be, and therefore some of these funds are either lost in translation or with not understanding what is the real issue at the local level. Now, more recently, if we go down to the field of climate change, they need to address climate change per se, especially in small islands, as diverted funds to fight poverty or other development deficits that were there before. So there is also this added, controversy. Now, this is not a bad thing per se, because of course we need to have funds to fight climate change or to address the issues and the negative consequences of climate change. However, many argue that this should come on top and above what are the development needs of countries. There is another issue here that most of the research tells us that the majority of these climate change solutions when it comes to international aid tend to favor technical or engineering solutions with big projects that might be temporary and might not look into the local needs and the local knowledge to support perhaps even autonomous forms of good adaptation that are going on. And this, I'm sure Patrick will talk more about this later on. Now, aid, therefore, must perhaps rethink the way it is deployed if we want to increase its effectiveness. And this is not only true for the donor community, but also for the local authorities and countries that receive aid, which perhaps should also try to look at aid as an opportunity and not just, sometimes as a vehicle to maybe divert or use it as a way of creating consensus. Now, what is the new way of looking at development? How can this perhaps be discussed as innovative? Now, we know from available research, and again, I look at also the work that Patrick has done during these years, which is fabulous. We know that local communities have know relatively well how to cope with the immediate impacts of climate shocks. Also, how to build sustainability in the future. Why? Because, of course, their knowledge was forged by centuries of millennia of experience, right? Now, given the resources, but which are often lacking, this knowledge could be employed to foster long-term adaptation to this, to climate change, especially. Therefore, and paradoxically, an innovative way to look at international aid would be to go back to support local forms of adaptation, to dialogue a bit better with the local knowledge of communities, and perhaps to even measure forms of success of the aid more on the spectrum of well-being rather than focusing only on GDP or income per capita. Okay, so the objective of aid should not be how much more income has this community had, which is also part of it, but not the only part. Okay, so even measuring the effectiveness of aid could go onto the spectrum of well-being, not focusing on GDP. Now, going to the conclusions, there are, having said this, there are many good examples coming from SIDS and islands in general. In fact, islands have increasingly been taken as again, many use this vocabulary as laboratories on how to change things. So basically, many islands lead the way in operations that adopt long-term sustainable development. Why so? Because it is relatively easier to operate in islands. It is faster to find authorities that respond promptly. And the social capital and probably the resourcefulness of people also comes in hand and can facilitate the life cycle of projects. So islands have been targeted as a good example also by the international community as to prove that a project can work in a relatively smaller period of time. Now, from Orkney in Scotland, Fiji to Seychelles, also Barbados and Jamaica, many SIDS are adopting and are launching ambitious programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to shift towards renewable energies and be finally self-sufficient in terms of energy production. And this is very good. They have ambitious target by 2020, by 2030, 2050 to become completely independent in terms of producing their local renewable energy, which is great. However, we'll go back to the first point of development aid. Supporting these schemes is much more expensive for islands because the per capita cost of running this is much higher. So where should this money come from? Now, there are, of course, the debate is very big. However, one way of thinking about this is, for example, redirecting some of the subsidies that are used nowadays to fund fossil fuels, right? So we always think that there is, of course, and there is lack of resources. However, believe it or not, every year about 5 trillion of US dollars, which is almost 7% of the total GDP of the world, it goes to subsidize fossil fuels. Now, perhaps, I'm just putting it there, asking for a friend, as they say, we could think of diverting some of these funds to be used in international aid to support these initiatives, especially for those places where these initiatives have a higher cost. In islands, this is could be a brilliant opportunity and could be also be accounted for in this area of development, which is sometimes a bit forgotten. There could be, of course, many other things to talk about, and I have a lot of more that I would like to say, but I'll leave it here. Wait for other questions and interactions with other colleagues, so perhaps we can talk about other aspects later on. Thank you for your attention.
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you very much, Stefano. Bang on time. You raised some very interesting points, including some polemic ones, of course, considering the value of development aid, considering the value of investment in renewable energy projects on island, especially those that come with a solutionist engineering philosophy, some of which may run contrary to local wisdom. And I found the proposal of looking at traditional ways of managing the environment as innovative, in spite of the contradiction. I find that quite insightful and worth thinking about. So now we move on to Professor Nunn, Patrick. Patrick, the question for you is, are there any innovative solutions out there in relation to climate change? And I invite you to kick off your presentation and share your screen. Thank you. We can see your slides.
Can you see the full screen?
No, not yet. Now we can.
You can see the full screen?
Yes. Wonderful.
Well, thank you all very much for coming to listen to this. I think it's an excellent initiative, and I think everyone has made quite a lot of introductions, so I'll plunge straight in. Most of my experience on islands has been in the Atlantic, has been in the Indian Ocean to some extent, and really focused on the Pacific Ocean. And I've done a lot in small island developing states, or SIDS. So it's really more about those that I want to talk today than others. And I want to talk about thinking outside the box, how we can think of innovative ways to reframe adaptation for survival in island worlds. And I want to talk about a number of things. First of all, surviving climate change on islands. And you may think surviving is a strange choice of language, but the more I look at the impacts of climate change on islands and the ineffectiveness of external interventions for helping people cope with climate change, the more it occurs to me that we really are talking about something that's about survival. In many cases, not in all cases, but survival of island peoples into the foreseeable future. The second thing I want to talk about is something that nobody talked about 10 years ago, which was relocation. I was reading a newspaper article recently about Florida in the United States, and politicians in Florida refuse to mention the word relocation because it terrifies people, it terrifies voters. But any scientist who has studied the projections and takes them seriously must surely understand that relocation is going to be one of the defining responses to climate change over the next 20 or 30 years. The next thing I want to talk about is how we can rethink some approaches to adaptation. And I want to talk about three things. The first thing I want to talk about is autonomous adaptation. In other words, how can people help themselves rather than wait for other people to come and help them? And the second thing I want to talk about is even more controversial, given that my friend Stefano was talking about the need for funds to fight climate change. I want to talk about cashless adaptation. And really the background to that is that people on islands, at least in the Western Pacific, have been there for 3,500 years. And they have survived many changes of climate within that period without any need for cash. So I think there is a case to be made for going back to the way things were before, going back to cashless adaptation in many contexts, not in all contexts, as a way to sustain people into the future. And then again, picking up on something that Stefano said, which was the use of traditional knowledge. And there's no question about it that there is a huge amount of traditional knowledge available in many island contexts that is underutilized and undervalued in many adaptation strategies. So the first thing I want to talk about is surviving climate change on islands. Islands, of course, are more exposed than larger land masses to climate change because they have a very, very high proportion of coastline to land area. So they're very exposed, particularly to anything to do with the ocean. When the ocean goes up and down, it has an immediate impact on island food supply and on island land areas and so on and so on. And surviving climate change, I think, is also about livelihoods. And I'm talking here mostly about subsistence livelihoods, people who acquire the food that they live on, they survive on every day from the environment around them. And I think in many cases, island livelihoods are far more exposed, more vulnerable than elsewhere to climate change, particularly from rising sea levels, particularly from stronger tropical cyclones, and particularly from rising temperatures, all three of which have demonstrably changed around many islands, most islands in the, certainly in the Central and Western Pacific over the last 50 to 60 years. So how is this going to play out? I think one of the big things is that climate change is going to force an increase in human mobility in island worlds. This photograph is from the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea, many of which have been abandoned because they are low atoll islands and people have been reluctantly relocated to Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. I think we're going to see a lot more mobility increasing in these kinds of situations over the next few decades. But mobility increases apply largely to low-lying islands, not to high ones. I'm a great believer that effective and sustainable adaptation is possible in many high island contexts if the adaptation narrative changes. And all of you should have access to this study that I did with Rosalind Kumar in 2019, which was about cashless adaptation to climate change. It's unwelcome. Nobody wants to be told that they don't need money. But I would also say, or we also said, it's unavoidable. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So the second part of my talk today is about understanding the need for relocation. And I accept that there are lots of question marks over future projections of climate change. But the science is very robust. The IPCC is producing by far the most robust projections of future climate change, including sea level rise, as you can see here, that have ever been produced. And with each assessment report, the robustness of these projections becomes ever greater. And this graph on the right here shows how sea level is likely to continue rising for decades, probably even centuries. A lot depends on how we as humanity controls our emissions of greenhouse gases. But by and large, we are looking at quite significant rises of sea level. By the end of this century, 2100, by the end of the next century, 2200, and beyond, which will have massive impacts, if they come true, on island coasts. For this kind of reason, short-term adaptation like seawall construction is not a good investment for vulnerable coastal communities on islands. This is a study that I've been involved with for a number of years now. It refers to Novunievu village in the province of Bua on Vanuatu Island in Fiji. And you can see there, I won't go into great detail, but you can see there the remains of the 1970s seawall, the remains of the 1990s seawall, Novonievo has pretty much given up building seawalls now, and every high tide the water gets right inside the village. So this is not unusual. This is the kind of thing that you see across many island coasts in the Western Pacific. And it's far better for that reason to consider what I call anticipatory transformational adaptation, thinking what we need to do to be sustainable in terms of our livelihoods and the place where we want to live 50, 60 years from now. And I think relocation is an obvious answer to this. Many people, of course, think that relocation will be hugely disruptive and expensive, and it'll lead to cultural collapse and economic ruin. Well, not necessarily. If it's managed badly, of course, it'll lead to those things. But if it's managed properly, with proper understanding of what is likely to happen in the future, if it's managed gradually and cooperatively, then the process will not lead to any of those things. And we have Jakarta now that's in the process of being moved to Kalimantan. We have a smaller example at Fangasar on Upolu Island in Samoa, where you can already see houses moving up the hill slope behind the old village as a form of adaptation to the effects of rising sea levels. And I'd also like you to consider the point that before globalization, island peoples were far more mobile than continental peoples. Often every 2 or 3 generations on islands that I've studied in the Pacific, people moved for one reason or another. Maybe the site went underwater, maybe maybe there was warfare, maybe all sorts of things to access resources, but there was a lot more mobility in island worlds than there probably was in most continental worlds. So the last part of my talk today is about how we can rethink approaches to adaptation. Some people are suggesting that the world is starting to deglobalize, so to reverse the process of globalization that we've experienced for the last 50, 60, 70 years, meaning that in the future, both nations and communities will have to do more than they do now to help themselves. Here are some examples of island communities not helping themselves, depending on outsiders. And of course, as Stefano was saying, parachuted development is one of the ways that bedevils the effectiveness of these kinds of interventions. And what Rosalind and I are arguing in our 2019 paper is that it seems likely that in aid countries, in developed countries, as the costs of domestic adaptation increase in the future, they will inevitably become less generous to so-called developing countries. So they will be forcing deglobalization, if you like, on these countries. And in archipelagic and island states, particularly SIDS, this will force what I describe as autonomous adaptation. Adaptation that's done by a nation or a community for themselves, by themselves, without outside assistance. And we have some excellent examples of this. Here are some books on the medicinal value of Pacific Island plants. These represent time-honored ways that people have helped themselves in the past and can do so in the future. And again, going to Indonesia, in West Kalimantan, there are many communities there that have a sustainable relationship with the forest and resist calls from loggers to cut that forest down. So I think in many archipelagic and island communities, I'm not talking here about cities, autonomous adaptation will be helped by reviving methods of traditional coping and reducing their dependence on cash. I think this is really important. There is a tendency, I think, in a lot of island contexts that when there is a disaster, people sit on their hands and wait for help to arrive from outside. Well, that didn't happen 200 years ago, 500 years ago. People helped themselves. People got on and restored their livelihoods the best that they could. And that was a very effective form of adaptation. I think, as Stefano said, all actors need to acknowledge the need for new approaches to adaptation. And this is something that we talked about with Karen McNamara and the crowd there in our 2020 paper in Nature Climate Change. We concluded that community-based adaptation initiatives in the Pacific Islands had suffered from outside agencies designing and implementing those adaptation initiatives. We think that island governments should reduce their growing dependence on external funding, and that donors, international bilateral donors, should facilitate adaptation, but not drive it. What does someone sitting in Geneva or New York know about the realities on the ground in Tuvalu or in Timor-Leste? Very little, I would suggest, compared to the communities, compared to the people who live there and who plan to continue to live there. And if I've just got time, I'll just read this really quickly. The role of implementers and donors is to prepare and support communities to lead their own adaptation. Because if that doesn't happen, we need, well, I won't go through all this, but it's time to support these communities' diverse capacities and allow their situated and tacit resources to flourish. And communities should be valuing their traditional knowledge, not pretending that their traditional knowledge is no use, not pretending that it's not able to contribute to managing the future. And again, if I had more time, I could talk about that at length. Thank you, Terima kasih. Grazie. And there are 4 recent papers that I've produced with some of my colleagues there. I'm happy for this PowerPoint presentation to be shared with anyone who would like it. So you can click on the internet links there, and that will take you to articles in the conversation that summarize the key messages of these articles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Another excellent presentation. I see we have a very interesting combination of images and text taking part in this seminar today. I like the resort to limited text and lots of images because it helps people think even beyond the ways in which conceived by the presenter. It's one of the exciting ways in which text and images help to aid reflection. Patrick, you reminded me in your presentation about the effects of COVID-19 on the ways in which communities have been in a way forced to help themselves. Many islands have found themselves in splendid isolation, of course, cut off from travel, from tourism and so on. Transportation has been pared down to a minimum. And therefore, in a way, I think the whole business of being self-sufficient and generating one's own needs has almost become inevitable, as you put it, inevitable adaptation in the context of COVID-19. But I'm sure we'll be hearing more about this later on. It's time to hand over to Aiden. We've moved from contexts and policy issues, development policy issues, to measures of how to put that into practice, including the contentious idea of relocation. Again, I'm sure we'll have questions about that. And now we move on to how to handle the knowledge and the data, and whether there are any gaps in that knowledge and data relating to climate change. Aideen, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So, hello, my name is Aiden Foley, and I'm a senior lecturer in environmental geography at Birkbeck University of London. So we've been hearing a little bit about the need for autonomous adaptation and the need to anticipate future change so that we can respond to it with forethought. And data has a huge role to play here. And climate models are one kind of data that can help to inform and scope out possible adaptation actions. But there's also limits to the granularity with which this particular kind of data can be delivered. And that's an important consideration in island and small states. And even if there were not those limitations, we would need other kinds of data in order to unpack the social and cultural dimensions of climate change. So in today's talk, I'm going to start with a crash course introduction to climate models. I'll then briefly discuss the benefits and limitations of downscaling, which is a technique for generating regional data from global projections. And finally, I'll present some possibilities for creatively drawing on other kinds of data at the local scale which can complement and be complemented by climate model data at the regional scale. So briefly, climate models work by dividing the world into three-dimensional boxes and calculating the flows of energy and moisture between boxes, and correspondingly the climate variables like temperature and precipitation. It sounds quite similar to weather forecasting models, and indeed climate models are a relative of weather forecasting models, but we can't treat climate model projections in exactly the same way as we would weather forecasts. When we're looking at climate model runs out to the end of the century, we're not looking at predictions. That is, we're not looking at a forecast of what will happen day by day or even year by year, but information about how the climate might respond over the long term to human influence. So it's not a crystal ball, but a sample of plausible pathways which can help to fuel our conversations about climate adaptation, and importantly, help us think through the robustness of options that might be on the table when it comes to adaptation. I like to think of climate model outputs as plausibilities, so it's more reasonable than a mere possibility, but not saying that it's a certainty or a prediction. Very briefly, let me explain why we can't talk about future climate of a particular place in quite the same way with quite the same confidence as next week's weather. There are several sources of uncertainty that we need to keep sight of, and the greatest uncertainty, the unknowable uncertainty in all of this, is us, humans. Climate models need to be fed information about what the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is going to be in the future in order to model how the climate is going to respond to that. And that depends on trajectories of human development. So to feed that information into the models, we use a set of scenarios called representative concentration pathways. These pathways of future climate forcing are designed to be compatible with a range of possible different futures, rather than being consistent or reliant on a specific set of policies. And for now, we're tracking RCP, representative concentration pathway 8.5, most closely, but there's no likelihood attached to any of these RCPs. And it's important to remember that by quantifying the impacts associated with any scenario, we are kind of dynamically altering its probability. As in every time traveling movie you've ever seen, having information about the possible future has the potential to change it. Epistemic uncertainty is the scientific uncertainty in modeling climate processes, and this is about our knowledge of what the system might do and how much of that knowledge we can pack into models given constraints on computing power. Differences in how models are programmed inevitably leads to differences in what the models say about the future. You can see this in this graph here, where lines of the same color represent different models driven by the same RCP, and the lines diverge as small differences in model construction lead to alternative futures. But while the details vary, the overall message is the same, that the climate is warming and higher emissions would mean more warming than a future where climate mitigation is undertaken. Finally, we have ontological uncertainty, also called random or stochastic uncertainty, and this refers to the inherent variability of the climate system. If you run the same model multiple times, you would likely get slightly different results on account of this. All of this adds up to a wide envelope of uncertainty in future generations if we're looking out to the end of century. On different timescales, different sources of uncertainty dominate, with internal variability being a bigger issue in shorter term projections and scenario spread being a bigger determinant of longer term future ones. Now, so far we've been talking about global outcomes from global climate models, but the scale of decision making on islands and small states is clearly quite different. While the size of the grid boxes used for global climate modeling varies, those used in the Couple Model Intercomparison Project, Phase 5, average roughly 2 degrees latitude by longitude. I think it was maybe close to 1.8, but for the sake of an easy square, I went with 2 here. The resolution is always improving, but you can see that at the moment it's too coarse to even acknowledge the existence of an island like Mauritius, which would get labeled as an ocean grid cell in a global climate model. So to overcome these limitations, dynamical downscaling or regional climate modeling is one technique that can be used to generate regional insights. And this is where a climate model similar to the ones used at global scale is run over a limited area. the reduction in area frees up computational resources that can be aimed at increasing the resolution. For example, Lee et al. Used a set of RCMs to learn about possible changes in cyclone activity under climate change and find that there is an increase in track density over the East Asia coastal region in their suite of RCMs that they used. So at the regional level, models are capable of giving us helpful insights into what the challenges of our future climate might be, giving us a base from which to anticipate what we might need to do. But you'll note that the size of the boxes here is still not enough to resolve the topography of a small island at roughly 50 kilometers squared. The issue is that if computer resources are a finite resource, if you have a set amount of computer resources to devote to your modeling, then in order to add more resolution, something has to give. And we can visualize this as a triangle. If you want to increase the area of that triangle while keeping the resolution side of the triangle the same, it means compromising somewhere, perhaps on the level of detail in terms of the level of processes represented in the model, or maybe on the length of the simulation that you run, so the amount of years that you model forward. As such, increasing resolution more and more might not actually add a lot of meaningful value for island decision makers, but interviews with decision makers highlight a mismatch here in expectations, with decision makers in small islands saying that they want more precise downscaled data, and scientists and climate service providers struggling to explain that this might end up being a costly investment for limited results. So rather than trying to increase model resolution or the scale at which data is presented beyond what's meaningful right now in terms of technical possibility, what other forms of data could complement the messages from models at regional scale when it comes to informing adaptation at the local scale? And here's where I think we need to diversify the kinds of data that get brought to these conversations. So firstly, we need to rediscover our historic data and find new ways of looking at it to inform adaptation. Historic meteorological data can be a little difficult to come by for more remote locations, with some locations like this record for Nandi on the main island of Fiji, Viti Levu, having reasonably long and relatively complete records, while this station on the second largest island, Vanuatu, is noticeably shorter and gappier. Now, it might be assumed that such data is less useful for helping to understand climate impacts, but I would argue that this assumption is based on an empirical research tradition of using past observations to calculate and quantify risk. Since climate change is changing the baseline anyway, we shouldn't be using the past to quantify the probability of extreme weather events, for example. But what we can do is use data and stories about significant events in the past to build and talk through scenarios for the future, for instance, drawing on participatory futures methods. We also need to keep in mind that just because digitized data sets are showing a gap, this doesn't mean the data is not there. National Met Services may have paper records that haven't been digitized and so are inaccessible to all except those who can physically visit an archive. And data rescue projects are doing great things here to get things digitized. And Zooniverse is an example of a really user-friendly platform for building and participating in such projects anywhere in the world. Secondly, there's a need to prioritize the knowledge of island people. Emphasizing climate models and computational tools alone runs the risk of devaluing local knowledge and stories when we need more than ever for place-based awareness of environmental and climate risks and coping strategies to overcome them to stay embedded in people's lives. Participatory mapping and timelines can be useful here, and this is an example from Stefano's research actually with a community in Fiji, in which the key resources and facilities were mapped along with climate threats in a focus group. Another organization I collaborate with, called Proboscis, has had an ongoing project in Papua New Guinea, developing with Indigenous communities a toolkit for documenting traditional knowledge for future generations. It combines digital technologies and paper with a notebook template that can be printed out and used to document traditional ecological knowledge, and then that notebook can be easily digitized to create an online library of books. The community was given a laptop, scanner, and printer and trained in their use, and that project became self-sustaining. The toolkit has also been used in Vanuatu and is freely available for communities to adapt to their needs. At the other end of the scale are wholly digital methods of gathering and generating local knowledge. For example, participatory mapping has been used to crowdsource information in the aftermath of disasters. And this map displays crowdsourced reports about public infrastructure in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Hazards like blocked roads or collapsed bridges can be photographed, geotagged, and added to the map by members of the public. And these kinds of participatory maps are very simple to set up. I'm currently developing one myself using a tool called Survey 123, where the survey collects islanders' stories about impactful climate events. And then the inputs to that survey are set up to trickle through to a web map using the platform ArcGIS. And this grows without further work by the person who set it up. It grows naturally as more people add their stories. Of course, with some of these tools that I've mentioned, internet and mobile connectivity is crucial in order to make the most of those technologies, but this might be a challenge in some small island contexts. World Bank data suggests that almost 70% of the population across Pacific Island small states are not using the internet, meaning the participants in that survey had not used the internet in any form from any location in the last 3 months at the time the data was collected. So enhancing access to the internet would open up a lot of possibilities for supporting climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, but also in terms of things like education, access to online courses, business and the digital economy. There's a lot of positives there. So the key messages from today: climate models are invaluable, but they work best in conjunction with local data, especially for island and small states, where there's a spatial scale mismatch, perhaps, between the scales at which climate model data is meaningful and the scales at which decisions need to be made. Every place has its own datascape, which consists of scientific, historic, cultural, and all other kinds of data and insights. And by blending old data like historic records with new data like climate model outputs, we can get a fuller sense of the challenges ahead and how communities might meet them. Collaboration is key here across different disciplines and stakeholder groups in order to make sure that we're hearing and drawing on different types of data. The methods we use for generating and working with local data can also blend new and old approaches, and to make the most of some of those newer tools that I've mentioned for citizen science and crowdsourcing, internet and mobile connectivity would be key. I've left a list here of some of the resources that I've mentioned today, and this will be shared with you after the talks today. And there's also a reading list here, including some of the references and also some extra papers which might be of interest on this topic. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions after today's session, then don't hesitate to email me and get in touch.
Thank you, Aiden. Perfect timing, 15 minutes. I'm really impressed. And you gave us so much food for thought, my gosh. Well, I'm not sure about the rest of you, but I'm feeling quite comfortable in the knowledge that we have a really rich database here available to us. Now we've had 3 different arguments, 3 different presentations using somewhat different approaches to the topic. One more, shall we say, theoretical, conceptual, one more policy-based, and the other much more data-based and science-based, even though some very interesting contradictions have come out. So we heard about tradition as innovation. We heard about cashless societies. We've also heard about participation in the context of 21st century science. You know, some of these concepts don't necessarily go together in our minds. We've also had a few questions tabled in the chat. And with the permission of the people who tabled them, I'm going to paraphrase them for the benefit of the panelists and the other members of this webinar. We start with Mario Cabral from Timor-Leste. He is asking the panel, how do universities impact policy? How do people like us, social scientists, geographers, climatologists, actually get the politicians to listen to us and perhaps implement what we consider to be sound practices? That's the first question. The second question by Charles Youssef from Malta. Adapting to climate change is much easier when it is done gradually. What happens when people are in a rush and decisions need to be taken perhaps in a more hurried and rapid way? There is no time for culture to evolve. Decisions need to be, up to speed and taken on the spur of the moment, perhaps. Look at what's happening in St. Vincent these days, today, perhaps. Things are very much hurried on the ground and there's no time to plan and people need to move forward. How do you do that? A third question by Milene Allegria. Does the islanders' ability to survive climate change and rising seas depend on the physical existence of their islands? This is part of the dilemma of advocating relocation. Are we to assume that this is indeed one of the roads to follow? Or is that already giving up in a way on our place, the place that we call home? And fourthly, a question by Gustav Mamangki. How do we turn the clock back on modernization? It's much easier said than done. Many of our societies are now addicted to the comforts, the trappings of modernity, the comforts of Western foods, Western drinks. Is it so easy to shut the door and advocate for self-sufficiency? Should we go back to breadfruit and water instead of bread and Coke? Who would like to start answering these really interesting questions? Stefano, you're smiling.
Just very interesting questions. I'm gonna tackle the question by Mario Cabral from Timor-Leste. Thank you for asking that. Of course, it's not easy to do something like that. It's not a walk in the park, as we would say. Also, I think that not all researchers and academics feel confident with having an active role in changing things, okay? And that is okay. I mean, some might just want to do that. No, it's not my approach to that. I mean, I feel more like there is a role, there is a social role of researchers. After you do, you come up with the interesting findings and important findings. So one of the answer I would have to that question would be to researchers should be more inclined to include a section or to study, to have an approach to the research by including something that has a policy relevance. So any type of research could be useful to policy in one way or another. And so I think that we should, that should be a first point, right, from the researcher point of view. Then perhaps we could make an extra effort to identify what policies to be changed or supported or nudged by research, and then perhaps create an alliance with stakeholders and understand how to build consensus over those findings. Now, consensus is very important because it's what drives politicians to act, really. So perhaps, once the solution is out there or the research is out there and there is enough consensus over changing certain patterns which might not work or could work better, that consensus shared with other stakeholders, could let politicians to start changing things. Now, of course, there will always be resistance because things are difficult to change at times. And perhaps, some researchers might not want to be involved in this because it takes time and it's not, perhaps some might say is not our work. But I believe, there is that element of perhaps, involvement, which I think is very important. So that could be perhaps one way of answer to the question by Mario. I will leave the floor for my colleagues to answer to others.
Yes, thank you, Stefano. Patrick?
Yeah, I don't agree entirely with Stefano. I think we've moved beyond that point now. Australian university researchers are now judged not by the amount of grant money or the number of publications, but by the impact of their research. So there's an awful lot of emphasis now in Australia on people getting out and talking to policymakers. So my short answer to that first question, which was a very good one, is write, publish, and talk to people. The last time I was in Fiji, I gave a talk to the Ministry of Italke Affairs, Indigenous Affairs in Fiji, about relocation, because they deal with people on the ground. They're not politicians. They deal with people on the ground. They wanted to know how to convince rural communities to think about relocation. And I think that's the way forward. And I think academics have a huge role in this. I think we should be getting out. We should be at the front of all this, not sitting in the back. But look, I do agree with Stefano that this was never the traditional role. It was never what people did 20 years ago in universities, but I think the whole ball game has changed now. Godfrey, can I just talk quickly about the third question, which I thought was really interesting? Does survival depend on the physical existence of islands? No, it doesn't. I think the relationship that humanity has established with place today is a very recent thing. If you look at the last 200 years, you can see that in the words of an American historian, John Gillis, the continents have been hollowed out as people have rushed from the interior of the continents to their fringes. We've become coastal people within the last 200 years. We've developed a sense of entitlement to coastal living that we never had in the distant past. My feeling in the Pacific is that the attachment to place is something that is readily overcome. And Rambi is a good example. There are lots and lots of examples in the Pacific of where people have relocated from what they regarded as their traditional land and have ended up in a place where they have reinvented themselves, where they sustain their culture and everything else. So I think we sometimes place too much emphasis on this attachment to place.
Very interesting point. Thank you, Patrick. Aiden.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question about informing policy. There's been a lot of kind of calls for climate scientists to be better storytellers in recent years and kind of find ways to make the findings and the outputs from these models more accessible. And like Patrick, in the UK, the emphasis is very much on impact at the moment and research and proposals for research projects being judged by that. But I think we're still kind of moving from a model of do research, communicate research to policymakers to really needing to explore what policymakers and other stakeholders as well. So I would consider the need to talk to members of the public here too as part of informing things. We need to kind of consider how the research itself as well could be shaped in order to help tell those stories better, I think. So increasingly, it's kind of about co-creating the research and partnering with policymakers from very early stages in order to ensure that what gets produced actually does feed in and can have an impact. I think we need to move away from sort of doing our research in our silos and then thinking about how we can tell people about it to a more kind of co-creative way of working.
Thank you, Aiden, for reminding us. Sorry? Somebody talking? No. Okay, sorry. Aiden, thank you for reminding us that it's not just the output of research, the end product, if I may say so, that needs to be communicated and shared and explained and massaged through different layers of society, the political, the social, etc. But it's also the research question that gets asked. Sometimes it's also important to keep your ears to the ground and see what kind of research is needed by the local community and is therefore driven by that community, because that, by definition, then builds buy-in, and people are really interested and anxious to read the conclusions of that research and are therefore more likely to run away with them. I think it's a good point. We're starting to call it research engagement. I think it's an obligation now also expected by those looking for European money, for example. Many projects financed by the European Commission now expect a section rationalizing that research in terms of research engagement. How does that connect with the needs on the ground? Patrick, you used a word earlier that I had never heard before, deglobalization. And I think it's worth expanding on this because, of course, much of what you say, in a way, is the manifestation of deglobalization. You refer to the return of a non-cash society back to traditional knowledge. It's as if the heyday of globalization is over, and we are now going back to a regime, a protocol, where people are more protective of themselves, more territorial, perhaps more suspicious of international relations. And of course, the smaller the jurisdiction, the smaller the island, then presumably the greater the obligation to depend on less and more meager resources.
Well, I think you've summarized it very nicely. And look, I think Godfrey and Stefano and Aiden probably know far more about this sort of thing than I do. I'm just basically a geologist who's pretending that he knows about other things as well. It just occurs to me that deglobalization is taking place. And I think that the primary motivator is going to be the fact that the international community will become far less generous towards poorer countries in the future than those countries have become accustomed to. So it's going to force increased autonomous adaptation on those countries and also on the more remote communities in those countries. So I see, and I think COVID has accelerated this this process. But this is how I see the future playing out. Not necessarily a future that's more sort of internationally confrontational, but just a future where there's much more sort of hands off. Hey, well, you know, that's your problem, Fiji. That's your problem, Indonesia. You know, I know we would have helped you 30 years ago, but we're not prepared to do that anymore. We need to, you know, Brisbane is going underwater. We need to do something about that, and that's taking all our resources.
Thank you, Patrick. And speaking of COVID-19, we actually have a question from Atullah Rashid from the Maldives. How do you think we can use COVID-19 recovery efforts as an opportunity to enhance climate action in terms of both mitigation and/or adaptation in island contexts? Who would like to answer this? Stefano?
Yes, thank you for the question. I also like to say that, just to go back to the previous one and building on that, I completely agree that research should be full of engagement and actually talk to politicians, talk to stakeholders. I'm actually surprised of researchers who do not do things, do such things, because you know, I believe this is almost a core, right? And the evidence, also the efforts that we all put in research should somehow be directed towards a change, right? So this change also passed through the efforts of researchers. So I'm absolutely, you know, in agreement with that. Now, of course, this is $1 million question about the recovery. I think that there were many things that were discussed, you know, in not just in the scholarly literature, but you know, in general in debates. And I believe that, of course, having this this concept of linking health and climate towards building strong resilience is very important, right? So building a long-lasting post-pandemic recovery starts with recognizing that there is a strong link between the environment, climate change, and health systems, right? So the environment and climate and health crisis should prompt a profound rethink of how to invest in resilient health systems which support development of islands. Now, this is of course not easy, but I believe that, again, many good examples have started to come from islands. So the capacity of many communities to understand where the threat comes from and how to react promptly, perhaps coping in the short term relatively well to that shock, can teach a lot to how to understand the long-term trajectory of a response that can help to ideally avoid such crisis to happen, right, in the long term, but also to, build a more sustainable way of reacting to those threats, right? So, of course, it's not easy, and it passes through some of the incongruences that we have discussed before, in terms of aid, in terms of perhaps relocating or not, or understanding how the climate data can help us. But, I think there is enough evidence that tells us that we should move towards doing this. Perhaps, some upcoming behavioral science or that helps us to nudge certain changes can also help us to do that a bit faster. So fingers crossed, we're getting there.
Thank you, Stefano. You remind us that crises are also opportunities. There is actually a task force in Malta. It's called the Post-COVID-19 Task Force. It's made up of people with very different backgrounds, and they're looking at what to recommend to government to do from the lessons of COVID-19. And one of them, for example, is to build more food security in Malta. We cannot survive as a country which completely depends on many food items, on shipments that have to come from somewhere else. It's completely unacceptable. So this is, I think, is a lesson that probably transfers easily to other countries. We have time for a last question here. It's a question by Anugrah Adyastuti. It's addressed to Patrick. And this is about relocation again, Patrick. I think you've stirred the hornet's nest here. In many small island states, relocation implicitly will mean going to another country. Okay? Look at what's happening in St. Vincent these days. People are being relocated from their homes. They're not just being transferred to another part of the country. They've been sent to Antigua and Barbuda. They've been sent to Grenada. They've been sent to Jamaica. So it's really a very complicated thing. And what makes these other countries willing to accept these climate refugees in the first place?
Well, the people from St. Vincent, of course, are not climate refugees. And this sort of thing has happened throughout history, especially in island worlds. Disasters happen and people are relocated, whether they want to be relocated or not. What's happening in the Pacific, in the atoll countries, is very interesting, because for a long time there has been this global narrative that people who live on islands that don't rise more than 2 meters above sea level are incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise, and they are to some extent. But that ignores the fact that they have been living there for a long time. It ignores the fact that they traditionally have been quite mobile. And of course, it ignores their feelings. And one of the atoll countries in the Pacific, Kiribati, has just re-elected Tanes Maumau as president for the second term. And he got in there on a ticket of saying, we are not moving. We think that climate change threats to our country have been exaggerated. We're going to stay here. We're going to build up our land. We're going to live here. We have our self-respect, and we're not going to move. So I think they'll have to move eventually. I think probably in 30 years' time, there won't be habitable land left in places like many islands in Kiribati. But I'm trying to get here at the attitude. And I also said that, all over the Pacific, we see communities that have been relocated in the past from different places, and Rambi is one example. And a lot of geographers have worked in the Pacific actually monitoring the sort of the tracks of communities all over the Pacific. If I could just have another 30 seconds, one of the big challenges in the parts of the Pacific that I work in is convincing communities, rural communities, that relocation is a viable future option for them. Because they say to me, invariably, they say, look, this land has always been ours. Our blood is in the land. Our ancestors' blood is in the land. We were born here. Our church is here, and this kind of thing. And I say, well, okay, but let's talk about history. Before you lived here, where did your ancestors live? Oh, we lived down there. And before that, we lived up there. And so the traditional histories of many rural communities in the Pacific is a history that involves migration from one place to another, often with a number of environmental forcings, like sea level rise. So why that should then be anathema for the future, it suddenly occurs to these communities, well, we've done this in the past, why are we so wedded to this particular place in the future? And certainly a lot of the communities that I work most closely with in the Pacific are reconsidering autonomous relocation. The one I showed you in my presentation of Navunievu, they're a coastal community and they have come up with their own strategy. They've said every time a young man from this village gets married, he has to build his house further up the slope. Okay, he is not allowed to build it on the coastal plain. Every time someone gets married, they build their house up the slope. And what that will see is over the next 30 or 40 years, it'll see the gradual movement of that community up the slope. It's autonomous adaptation, it's community driven, it's culturally appropriate. It's great.
Thank you, Patrick. We've actually had 2 other questions fielded in the meantime. I'm going to paraphrase them both. And then I will ask all the panelists to come up with a very juicy, synthetic 60 seconds of wisdom to conclude this very, very exciting conversation. The first is by Crystal from Fiji. She is asking about how traditional knowledge, including languages, are not what they once were. Over time, they have incorporated English terms, for example. The question is, how do we overcome the loss of traditional information? And what about sparing adults to revert to traditional methods and to convey them en masse to the general public? Crystal is concerned with the practical application of what you have recommended. Finally, Michal Jasinski from Poland is asking a big picture question here. In the context of ocean level rising, he understands the ideas of small countries to reduce carbon footprints. But then what about the USA, China, India, the big players of the world and their carbon footprint? What do the panelists think about the actions taken, for example, by AOSIS or by Tong, ex-president of Kiribati? Are they changing or improving the situation on the ground? And perhaps Aiden, you would like to start, and then Patrick, and then Stefano to conclude.
So I think on the point about the loss of traditional languages or traditional knowledges, I think here, so much of it comes back to learning from history and remembering history and kind of remembering the knowledge that is there, as Patrick was saying. And sometimes it's just about looking at things in a slightly different way or looking for things in a different place. So, thinking about things like historical archives or the stories and legends that people talk about, we can find that there is traditional knowledge there, even if it's not perhaps, the forefront of people's mind. But perhaps also it's about the fact that the responses to a certain kind of environmental event in the past maybe isn't connected in people's minds quite yet with climate change in the present. So I think there is a lot to be gained by taking that longer duration historical point of view. And also there's the point as well that, societies are evolving and societies have always evolved. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily about a return to what was, but about taking what we can, building on what we can from traditional approaches and looking at that in light of the new challenges that we have today. So it's perhaps about what we build for the future rather than thinking about preserving and returning to something that once was. Because societies have always, as Patrick is saying, societies have always been evolving, have always been moving, and that's perhaps what we need to keep a hold of. Did you want me to speak to the other point as well, or shall I leave that for Stefano or Patrick?
You can take a few seconds to speak to the second point as well. Why not? Yeah,
of course, the larger countries need to do something about their carbon footprint. Everybody needs to do something. It needs to be a concerted effort in terms of mitigation. But I don't think that we can kind of stop talking about adaptation. Even if we were doing mitigation perfectly, there would be a certain amount of climate change already kind of booked in, so to speak, that we would need to be adapting to. So we need to talk about that regardless. I realize we've got 4 minutes, so I'll pass it over to Stefano and Patrick.
Thank you, Aiden. Patrick.
Thanks, Aiden. And I agree with everything that Aiden had to say, especially on the first point. And the thing that I'd say to Crystal is have a look at the Korovula paper that was at the end of my PowerPoint. And what we did there was we looked at 15 communities all the way across the top of Viti Levu Island in Fiji. And we looked at the degree to which they have and utilize traditional knowledge for coping with environmental adversity. And really interesting that study was as well. My 60 seconds, which is now down to about 40 seconds, was going to be about religion. And I've just edited a book with Johannes Lutz for Springer, looking at religion and its role in faith-based communities for climate change adaptation in the Pacific. And I think that this is hugely undervalued, people's faith as a way of effective climate change adaptation in many island contexts, not all island contexts, of course. You know, a lot of people that I've encountered in the Pacific Islands are completely contemptuous of Western science. They have no idea about science, and because for them, their worldview is one that is informed by God and what God wants and why God is doing particular things and what can be done to persuade God to do other things. And I think that this is an opportunity in many island contexts to underwrite really effective and sustainable adaptation into the future. In other words, engage rather than sideline people's religious or faith-based beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Stefano.
Thank you, Godfrey. So I think that there is a clear tendency worldwide, if not yet dominant, but growing, of trying to change the system that has led to many inconsistencies, and including creating climate change. So there is a strong movement, even in theories, to try to think more circularly and not linearly, therefore to reduce and change the way we consume and we produce in order to be more sustainable. There is a tendency to be more minimalist rather than buying and acquiring. Now, of course, this is not yet a global trend, and the actual initial trend set by Western society, which is overspilling to the developing world, has unfortunately taken over, and it is a bit difficult to steer at the moment. However, I believe that most of these changes are actually coming or could be read very positively from islands. The traditional knowledge, the way in which islanders with the resourcefulness as well as built responses have shown is that things can be steered towards something which is, gives not just hopes, but changes things on the ground. The remarkable changes that have been undertaken by islands in the last 5-10 years in response to climate change is exemplary. And I think that it's a bit undervalued actually by the international community. So I think that this is an area where we should build, especially international development, but also local actions. Therefore, I want to leave this with a bit of optimism. I think there is a lot that can be done, and we can learn from these initiatives, and this could really drive the way in which future actions, present and future actions, can take place. It's already happening. We just need to guide it and support it a bit better. And I'm sure that research has a lot to say in this, and I'm convinced that the active role of researchers can help to improve the situation even better.
Thank you, Stefano. It seems that one of the takeaways of this webinar is to look at the past to better prepare for the future. And this cuts across not just traditional science, but it also includes aspects like faith, aspects like participation and cooperation, aspects like traditional knowledge and traditional ways of doing things, it is another contradiction in a way that has come out of this wonderful conversation that we've had this morning. I am asked by the organizers to wrap up. It's 10:30 Central European summertime, so it's time to close. I would like to thank, first of all, the panelists, Aiden Foley, Patrick Nunn, Stefano Moncada, for coming up with excellent expert advice and information about climate change on the ground and addressing the theme of the webinar. And I remind you, the theme is innovative responses to climate change in islands and small states. I would like to thank the Archipelagic and Island States Forum for hosting this wonderful exchange of ideas. And I echo Stefano's call to arms in a way. This mix of tradition and modern science, I think it's very valuable. And what better place and what better communities to actually get it going than small islands, where people know each other, where distance between the community and the policymakers is relatively small, where hierarchies are thin. So even though people sometimes complain that policymakers and academics live on different planets, it's not the case at all in small island jurisdictions. Many of these policymakers were our students, for God's sake. They were in our classes. We've been impacting them and influencing them even before they became politicians. So if you want them to hear us, I think a phone call may be all it takes, or an email, maybe all it takes to arrange an appointment. So again, with that optimistic note, I want to conclude. I want to thank Levita Somali for supporting the organization of this event. And I wish you all a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening.
The Archipelagic and Island States Forum is a platform designed to facilitate 47 archipelagic and island nations to collaborate and cooperate in addressing common challenges in 4 thematic areas: climate change mitigation and adaptation, blue economy, marine plastic debris, and good maritime governance. In 2017, the idea to establish the multinational cooperation framework among the archipelagic and island states was first iterated during the UN Ocean Conference in New York. In November 2018, Indonesia hosted the first ministerial meeting with 21 archipelagic and island states. The Archipelagic and Island States Forum was established by Manando Joint Declaration. In the following year, the second ministerial meeting adopted the final outcome with 25 AIS participating countries. To achieve our vision, we focus on 4 objectives which we translate into our programs. Create an open, innovative, and engaging forum. Provide a space to share and implement innovative and tangible programs. Promote collaborative efforts among stakeholders. And create opportunity through the blue economy. Ideation, implementation, and evaluation are the core elements to our solution framework in addressing the problems. In 2020, AIS Forum launched programs to drive innovation, which are AIS Joint Research, a collaborative applied research program affiliated with academic institutions in AIS countries with various topics related to the 4 areas of collaboration. The Innovator Scholarship Program, a fully funded exchange program for talented individuals from AIS participating countries who can demonstrate exceptional leadership quality and creative mind, and AIS Innovation Challenge, to find innovative ideas and breakthroughs that can help societies and businesses to be more resilient and adaptive during crisis situations. AIS Forum also launched AIS Blue Startup Hub, a platform to connect marine-focused startup in 47 archipelagic and island states across the globe. AIS Blue Startup Hub Mentoring Program was launched with 18 participating startups from 6 countries. As an effort to realize the smart, innovative solutions, AIS Forum also engaged with public audiences through online events in a form of trainings, workshops, talk shows, and discussions with various topics and stakeholders across AIS participating countries. In light of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important for archipelagic and island states to have a resilient economy. Therefore, AIS Forum Secretariat introduces programs which focuses on blue economy. As a form of its commitment, AIS Forum developed Blue Economy Development Index, or BEDI. This index will be used as a tracking tool to determine the current use of coastal and marine resources, and it can be used as a tool to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Blue Financing Framework, or BFF, which provides a guidance for governments, financial institutions, philanthropists, and donors to align their investments with the blue economy principles and allow them to select a project to be financed in the blue economy sectors. Smart and innovative solution programs, such as sharing knowledge sessions with experts and representatives from AIS participating countries. Plankton, which was a competition to raise awareness in reducing marine plastic debris. Impact pitching, which connects startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, potential investors, and growth enablers to gain partnership. And Ending Plastic Pollution Innovation Challenge, which was a collaboration with Marine Plastic Debris Project from UNDP Indonesia to address marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Many solutions to challenges that affect AIS participating countries in 4 main thematic areas and SDG 14 goals are produced through collaboration programs. These programs will explore opportunities through innovation and experiment that benefits on a local, regional, and international scale through sharing knowledge and experiences between AIS participating countries.